couple of things that I think I wanted to add to what both David and the governor said. You know, the force of this concept of an Article 5 convention called by the states has been used before. Some of you may recall that the income tax was first passed by the Congress, U.S. Congress in the late 1880s. U.S. Supreme Court said unconstitutional. States during the progressive era in the early 1900s began asking for a federal income tax, and they passed resolutions for federal income tax for a convention. And when they got sort of to a critical mass, Congress said, you know, we were going to do that the whole time anyway. We'll pass the resolution. And that's how we got the 16th Amendment. Now, by the way, the talking points on that were that income tax would never be higher than 1% and only would tax 1% of the population. So this is what happens when you let the federal government draft something instead of states. And of course, Ronald Reagan was a big proponent of this. They got to 32 states on a balanced budget amendment, and that resulted in the Gramm-Rudman Act of the mid to late 1980s, which I would argue was a bigger driver in balancing the federal budget than any of the folks who happened to be there. With all due respect to the former Governor Kasich, who's then a budget chairman in the mid-1990s. So Congress knows about this. I'm not shocked at all that of the quote that David put up from, you could probably assign that to about 2/3 of the people in Congress right now. Well, we're not going to let the states decide how it is we spend money, which really sort of brings this whole thing to a head. Sometimes, you know, I think about this concept, and it's almost like maybe a Lord of the Rings movie where some ancient giant beast or some sort of secret or something is unlocked, and suddenly it's the greatest power that you know, but nobody knew about it, or it was lost for all time. And the basic concept here is that the states make the rules for the federal government. That's what our constitutional basis is. And we needed to have a strong federal government for a lot of reasons, mostly defense, but also to regulate interstate commerce and protect the rights of individuals that were not protected by the individual states, all of those things. But in fact, the 50 states are in effect a board of directors that dictate policy, or should dictate policy, to the elected federal officers, the president and the treasurer and the secretaries, et cetera, just like in a corporation. It's the same concept. And we know that Congress, of course, has done this before, but like most people, they're not going to say, I'm going to give my power to somebody else because I want to be able to do that. That's just not going to happen. So, as mentioned, the founders knew that, and that's why we have this alternate method. Now, one of the principal problems with having an Article 5 convention is the same problem that any Speaker of the House or President of the Senate, and certainly Governor Walker would have experienced this, is even in states where even in places where everybody's coming to the same place to work every day, it's hard to get everybody on the same page. Sometimes it's hard to get everybody to show up or to take a real interest in, and I'm talking about in state legislatures for those who have served in that, probably most of the people on this call. So think about that when you're trying to coordinate among 50 disparate legislatures who, despite the efforts of ALEC and other organizations, really rarely see each other, don't know each other very well. And in the age of term limits, it's even worse. It's even more difficult to really get to know folks and all of that. So, you know, for my own part, I sponsored the balanced budget amendment when we passed it, and Governor Kasich was instrumental in getting that passed here in Ohio. One of the other things I did was work with a group of legislators around the country trying to draft rules for an Article 5 convention. At one point, we had about 35 states participating in that, and we did pass rules. The great Tom Coburn in a dinner here in Ohio once said, you know, they can just draft rules when they start the convention. And I said, I understand that. Nobody has to do anything until a convention is called. But all of these efforts, as I've heard some folks say, they're all part of the movement for an Article 5 convention to happen. And I will have to say that often Article 5 convention seekers work at odds with each other, because people think, well, that's not exactly my idea, so I'm going to try to make sure that idea doesn't happen. And so there is a lot of infighting and backbiting and submarining that happens in this movement. And I think that's unfortunate. I don't think there's any way to stop it, because a lot of people sort of want their idea to go forward. And if they're talking about other ideas, they don't want to hear about that. And so that has been a problem, I think, in the Article 5 movement in the way that I've been involved for about 15 years. There are many state legislatures today that don't want a balanced budget at the federal government because of the money they get. They need the money from the federal government to balance their budgets and to pay. And they aren't looking at the long-term effects that when the federal government, not if, but when the federal government can't pay anymore, it is going to be the states that are most reliant on federal money, and the population, the people who most rely on that, who are going to suffer the most. But like most legislators and other public officials, they think about today and not tomorrow. So, but I will tell you that there are many things that most legislators agree on. You know, and if we don't all agree on a balanced budget amendment, and we don't all agree on term limits for federal judges or on repealing Citizens United, we can all fight about that. If we put the question and said, state legislators, how many of you would vote to allow the President of the United States to have a line item veto? Well, I think, and I'm sure Governor Walker knows better than me, I think 49 of the 50 governors, and maybe Vermont's the exception, have the line item veto in the United States, of the states. And the line item veto doesn't necessarily help the Democrats or the Republicans. Remember, by the way, Congress passed the line item veto. The US Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. So we, the states, can overrule the US Supreme Court. It's been done before. There have been a variety of times when constitutional amendments were passed that overruled a decision of the Supreme Court. The age of voting, there was a Supreme Court decision that said now states can say it's 21, and we passed a constitutional amendment that said no, it's 18. Whether you agree with the wisdom of that or not, it was the states reacting to a US Supreme Court decision by Congress passing an amendment and then the states approving that. So I do have a couple of ideas I've discussed with Governor and Walker and with David. And I think what we really need to do preliminarily is to gather the states, not in a convention. And we use these terms loosely, by to say when we say an Article 5 convention, and then we say convention of the states. And someone said to me the other day, well, these aren't Article 5 conventions, these are conventions of the states. And I thought, well, every ALEC meeting is a convention of the states, then if we're all showing up, or many of the states are. So there have been many conventions of states. We talk about Maryland, we talk about the Water Rights Convention back in the early 1900s, the recent event out in Arizona a couple of years ago. None of those are Article 5 conventions. They are states coming together and talking convention in one manner or another. I don't really like the fact that we sort of talk about those things as though sometimes they're the same. It's confusing on a confusing topic to many legislators who don't know that much about this, because let's face it, they've got other issues to deal with. I think that we need to have I'm going to use some other different words than convention: convocation, meeting, assembly, get together, powwow, sit down, whatever it is that everybody wants to use, to vet out any idea that anyone has. Now, for those of you yelling runaway convention into their computers. First of all, it's not a convention. And second of all, this isn't a binding vote. What I really think that we need to do is sit down and see what are the viable convention or viable amendments that can pass at a convention. And I think there are probably some that the Magic 34 or 40 states or more would agree on. I mentioned the line item veto. Would someone vote no on saying you can't take money out of Social Security trust funds to pay for ongoing operations? As the trustee of my employees' 401k plan, I would get arrested for doing that, by the way, and federal government's sort of standard operating procedure. So there are other things. So I'm going to be working on that. And of course, many of you, I hope, will try to participate in that. I think it needs to be driven by the leaders of the bodies. The Assembly state legislators, the effort I had on drafting rules before, there were some leaders in there, most notably Robin Voss, David Long. Those are well-known names, I think. But not everybody there was. And I think until we have, I guess my hope is, in theory, 99 state legislative leaders all sitting in a room saying yes or no to proposed resolutions, including a balanced budget resolution, I don't think we move the ball down the field. Now, I would love to see a lawsuit filed and a lawsuit prevail on having the convention on the balanced budget amendment. That's a huge step forward. And if that can happen, you know, I'll be passing resolutions in support of that if I can in the Ohio Senate. And but you know, it's my intention to try to move this ball forward on a broad base and begin to accumulate opinion of state legislators on not just a balanced budget amendment, but on a variety of other topics that I think can be successful.